Um, but given the sort of context of this group focused on ethnobotany, I thought it would be interesting to sort of think through in a kind of recursive way, but also retrospective way with my book project, what might have been different if I had approached it in more explicitly through the lens of ethnobotany. I'm not an ethnobotanist, but I had a really interesting experience about a year ago. I was giving book talks in London, actually, before I had this job here. Um, and I was speaking with some ethnobotanists who told me that my project was a project of ethnobotany and that, in fact, I was an ethnobotanist. And this was a quite shocking revelation to me because I've never engaged with ethnobotanical research that I knew of. And so, anyways, what that is to say is actually I'm gonna present today is actually material from my book that I've never actually talked about in a presentation before. So it'll be a lot more informal and rougher around the edges, but hopefully will feel more kind of appropriate and maybe offer actually some opportunity for real discussion and engagement, since I'm sure I'll not necessarily share things in the most polished way. But so, and I made this call like an hour ago, so it might be a little rough. I just want to see if I can get the right thing going and figure out which what screen are you seeing right now, Kate?
I just see like your first, like your title slide.
Okay, you see the right, like not the presenter view or anything?
No, no
Okay,
presenter.
great. So I'm going to dive right in because I know we don't have a lot of time. And so I've titled this little talk, "Is there a place for psychoanalysis and ethnobotany lessons from the illicit cactus trade?" And so I'm going to kind of brush over much more quickly than I normally would the hows and why of why I got into this work. But we can talk about that in the Q&A. I didn't do this is not based on my PhD research. It's based on my postdoctoral research. And so that's also a bit unusual for a first book project. But I came to the topic of illegal cactus trade as someone who knew nothing about it and was frankly quite surprised that there even was such a thing that we could talk about. But in the process, this was back in 2017, but in the process of first discovering and learning that there was such a thing as an illegal wildlife trade in cacti and that it was quite global in scope and also severe in terms of its consequences for a lot of different species of plants, it was nevertheless back in 2017 a topic that no one was really talking about very much. And then amidst my research, that kind of started to change quite quickly. And you suddenly had articles like this one on the front page of the science section of the New York Times, among many others. And so there are a number of reasons that it suddenly started getting a lot more attention than it had in the past. It's not to suggest that it wasn't happening as a problem before, but I think in part related to the sort of rise of popularity of ornamental plant keeping during COVID, there was just a sort of nicer media hook to kind of latch onto in a lot of these stories, but started to get a lot of traction in the media just while I was sort of in the thick of studying it, which produced some sort of interesting dynamics in terms of my relationship to talking about this topic. Um, but I'm just going to forge ahead, and we're just going to start from the basis that we can all accept that there is such a thing as an illegal wildlife trade in cacti, and we can talk more about the more boring aspects of regulatory conventions and stuff like that in the Q&A if people have questions about it. But where I want to go with this is talk about how this project for me really started from this place of just total curiosity and fascination. But it kind of also left me as a political ecologist as well as a social scientist wondering kind of where the intellectual gap was in the project or what kind of theory building I might be able to do through this project. Other than to say that there just was a total lack of rigorous social science research on the subject of ornamental cactus collection, and why it was occurring and sort of what the motivations for it were. I went into the project assuming quite naively that this was a sort of a matter of simply a matter of political economy. Um, and that sort of didn't get me very far in terms of its explanatory power. And eventually this sort of led me down this very different sort of theoretical and scholarly rabbit hole that was new to me, which was that I realized I didn't have a way in my own work of theorizing desire, in what it meant to think with desire in more sophisticated ways. Because what I found in a lot of this work is that while there was certainly money for some people involved in these trades, there was a lot else going on here related to, for instance, passion and desire and obsession and possession. And so I kind of became rather obsessed with a question that I'll frame quite naively, though, as why would people who seemingly love these plants the most love them into extinction? Why would they become engaged in activities that curtail their ability to flourish in the world? And that was sort of the sort of basic starting point for this project. And so I like to frame my project in what emerged as a study of plant people or a dedication to this hyphen that connects them. And this is a term that was used by a lot of my interlocutors. And here, this should already flag that maybe I should have been thinking about ethnobotany a little bit more than I already was. I like this quote. This is a quote not from one of my actual interviewees, but from a brilliant British television show called The Detectorists. If anyone's ever seen it, if you haven't, you should absolutely watch it. But there's a brilliant scene where these are people who go out metal detectoring. They're quite passionate metal detectorists, and they reminded me a lot of a lot of my interlocutors. And they this one character, Lance, who's the main character, says, "I had a friend once. He had a cactus, the same cactus sitting on his windowsill for 15 years. Then one day, someone gave him a second cactus, and within 6 months, he had to move to a bigger house with enough space for his cactus collection." And so I became really interested in sort of psychologies and psychoanalysis related to collector tendencies and behaviors and how that was intersecting with issues of the kind of more than human geographies of cacti, as well as their conservation and flourishing in the world. But I didn't have a kind of real vocabulary for thinking through desire in more sophisticated ways. uh, Again, we could sort of get into it, but long and short, eventually what I found was sort of extremely, for me, a body of theory and work that had extraordinary explanatory power that was also nevertheless very new to me. And so one way that this project was, there's a lot of ways that my project was hindered by COVID, but there were also other ways in which it was facilitated by it, in which, namely, I had a lot of time by myself to read. Um, and so, yeah, I sort of discovered, I could say I rediscovered Freud for myself, having encountered his work in undergraduate, but in particular the work of Jacques Lacan, psychoanalyst, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And I just wanted to kind of quickly highlight a couple of key terms without getting too deep into the weeds. Um, of how I came to thinking with desire as talking about more than something that we simply want. So I'm guessing most folks here, for instance, would be familiar with like Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, especially given folks' interest in ethnobotany. And like, while that's a really lovely and really fascinating book, it's certainly one I enjoyed when I first read it in college. Michael Pollan kind of misses what desire is actually all about in his book, which is to say it's about more than sort of imagining something that we just really want. Desire for Lacan is always structured through lack and the sort of fantasy of imagining a capacity to be reunified with what we imagine as a kind of imagined other. And it's this sort of desire for a imagined wholeness that we can never sort of encounter again as we enter the world as desiring subjects in infancy, that we go out into the world as desiring subjects in a very positive way, in the sense that we're always out in the world exploring and doing things. But importantly, rather than thinking of it in a positive sense around want, it's through thinking with lack. And sort of the sort of nature of the unconscious and the structure of the unconscious moves from there. And it's often bringing our attention more to issues around gaps and misses and elisions rather than thinking about necessarily what binds and connects us, but also like what doesn't. And so a couple of just key terms that relate to these ideas that were useful for me in this project include thinking with one of the most powerful ideas in Lacan's work, which is jouissance, this idea of a kind of painful pleasure. And jouissance is a complicated idea, but it's a really powerful one. There's a really brilliant quote by psychoanalytic geographer Paul Kingsbury, who writes that just as a Foucauldian geography absent of power would be sort of meaningless, I'm riffing here, a Lacanian kind of analysis without jouissance is sort of all equally meaningless. But jouissance is this idea that oftentimes what moves us out in the world isn't a sort of just desire for pleasure, but this particular kind of pleasure that has this sort of darker and side to it attached to issues around repetition, repetitive behaviors, this sense that we know we're never fully going to be satisfied by it, but the satisfaction that we get from always missing our object is in fact the pleasure of jouissance. So we could think of it as kind of aiming without attaining. Um, and so it's this constant missing of what we suppose we desire that is itself this form of pleasure and pain. We can get into sort of the what that means in more concrete terms in a little bit. Um, I'm going to move forward from here because but to say that there's a couple of kind of key ideas that really stuck with me in sort of thinking with psychoanalysis. Another big one was this idea of extimacy, and this is a Lacanian term that enjoins the idea of the interior, so like our interior unconscious selves, with the exterior world, which is to say that like in Lacanian thought, our unconscious selves aren't like represented by like some dark, shadowy cave that we don't have access to, but it's actually the unnerving experience of encountering the unconscious through the external world that we have the best access to sort of our unconscious selves. Which means to also say that there's ways in which the unconscious is quite geographic. Um, in more human terms, the best way of thinking about extimacy is sort of like if you're having a conversation with a really close friend and they describe something about you that really disturbs you because you, on one hand, know it's actually extremely true, but you would have never been able to see it for yourself. So in the way that people can actually know more about ourselves than we're able to see in ourselves, that's kind of quite a way of extimate thinking. And then lastly, I thought a lot about anxiety in my work, especially the anxiety of extinction. And anxiety in Lacanian thought is not just sort of a generalized hand wringing in the sense that we often talk about anxiety in popular terms, but is actually this really powerful signal of unconscious distress. And we can talk more about that as well. But these were some thoughts kind of after I'd done a lot of my research that I found quite powerful in my work. And so the overarching project of my book is this idea to kind of think through the relationships between the political economy of environmental change with the unconscious, and through turning to the unconscious, trying to develop a set of relationships to show how political economy shapes and adheres to psychic processes, but also vice versa. And then what the consequences of that are for the living world. And so, like, what is the power and political economy of fantasy, and how, for instance, nature is imagined by desirous collectors, and what is it actually that they're seeking to collect in going out in the world and, smuggling or looting rare and endangered plants in the world. And so one kind of way to start getting at this more closely to my interlocutors is from this nice quote from a British cactus collector who said, "Most of us will be quite happy with a cultured or grafted plant, but there will always be those of us who want the real thing." And I became very interested in what that real signified for the collector. What was more real, for instance, about the idea of going out and taking a wild plant from habitat versus, say, growing a plant from seed or cutting or from a nursery propagated plant. Um, what was happening in the realm of fantasy and in the realm of the unconscious that made something like a plant growing out in the world more real. Um, and this is sort of works in two senses of the word, because the idea of the real in psychoanalysis is is this idea of the sort of unmediated world that sort of is beyond signification, whereas the actual world that we all inhabit is the realm of fantasy. So I'm going to draw now on chapter 3 of my book, which is called Between the Iron Curtain and the Glass House. And it's about the very strange story of how and why it is that the Czech Republic, or what's known today as Czechia, became, through fascinating 20th century sort of history, one of the world's biggest epicenters of illegal cactus trade, which should be especially striking to us given it's a landlocked Central European country with no native cacti. And so this is new in terms of me. I don't normally actually talk about this chapter of the book, although I think it's maybe my favorite for a couple of reasons. But I was especially thought it would be useful to talk about and share with all of you, because there's a way in which we can read what I was doing as a kind of ethnobotanical study of Czech cactus collectors in a quite specific way in this chapter. And it's especially relevant to us today because actually just last month, 4 Czech men, including several very prominent members of the Czechoslovak Cactus and Succulent Society, were actually just arrested in Brazil in the very end of February 2026, caught with hundreds of wild harvested cactus plants from Brazil, as well as hundreds of cactus seeds in their boots and other places, attempting to smuggle them into Europe. And in perhaps one of the most check things possible, they attempted some of this covert smuggling of plants by opening up Brazilian beer cans and putting the cacti inside the beer cans. And this was probably in an attempt to try to avoid detection within X-ray machines. But how and why did we get here is the sort of question I want to think with, and how and why it's important to think about a very particular kind of cultural study of Czech relationships to cacti that very much requires also an engagement with fantasy and the unconscious that's my argument. And so to kind of start us off in this context, I want to introduce a character who might be actually familiar to some of you. I don't know. Feel free to like raise your hand and wave if you're like, oh, Alberto Fritsch, he's the goat. And the reason he might be familiar to some folks on the call, I'm not sure, is because in a lot of ways he was a very early ethnobotanist, although he never would have described himself as such. But what he was a dedicated amateur botanist who, over the course of his lifespan, spent decades of his life in Paraguay and Brazil and Uruguay, initially attracted to this part of southern South America because of cacti, but eventually becoming both an amateur ethnologist and ethnographer of a number of indigenous tribes of southern South America, but also an outspoken critic of German colonialism in the region, especially at a period of time of rampant genocide of indigenous communities. At the same time, today he's most known in the Czech Republic and or Czechia and Slovakia as a hero within the botanical, and in particular cactus and succulent communities. But arguably, in terms of his life's work, he probably did more to try to stop the mass slaughter of indigenous peoples in South America than any professional anthropologists living at the time. This is a picture of him on the left in middle age at his home in Prague in 1924, and this is the picture of him when he's older, is just a couple of years before his death, also in Prague. And so the way to start out this story is to say Alberto Fritsch is pictured here as a very young man on the left. This is an image that would have been taken within a Prague photo studio prior to his first expedition to Brazil. And we can think about all of the ways that fantasy and imagination is at work in this image of what he is imagining his experience in expeditions as a sort of botanical explorer is going to look like. Obviously, even though at the time Czechoslovakia was not a colonial power, we can nevertheless see how colonialist tropes are very heavy-handed in the kind of imagery that we see here of a young Fritsch with a gun and a pith helmet as he prepares for this first voyage. And in thinking with desire and lack, the reason that Fritsch chooses at the young age of, I think, 18 or 17 to head to southern Brazil on a botanical expedition is because he's first introduced to the practice of collecting cacti at a much younger age. He soon kind of catapults to the kind of upper echelons of Prague cactus collecting fame. The cacti are very popular in this period of early 20th century Europe as these very exotic and new plants to the European world. He's from a well-known and very prominent Czech family of intellectuals and patriots. His uncle was the curator of botany at the Natural History Museum in Prague. But within a matter of years, he has one of the most notable cactus collections in all of Central Europe. However, on a very, very cold night in the middle of winter, his entire collection freezes to death amid some fuel shortages. And it's shortly after this mass death of all of his plants that he determines that he should go to southern Brazil and see these plants for himself. And so we can see in a lot of ways how lack actually sort of jettisoned his desire. The reason I have this picture of Karl May, titular character of Old Shatterhand pictured on the right is again to sort of reinscribe the importance of imagination and fantasy in relationship to ideas of the West, in the context of a Central European context. So Old Shatterhand were these stories written by a very famous German author, children's book author named Karl May. He's not really well known in the West or the US, or the English speaking world today, but he's extremely popular still to this day in Germany. There's a Karl May amusement park, for instance, where people still dress up like cowboys and Native Americans. Um, but this is someone that Fritsch would have no doubt read as a young boy living in Czechoslovakia. And we can sort of see how much of these ideas of a sort of exoticized West are rubbed off on a young Fritsch. It's worth noting, in this case, that Karl May never actually visited the American Southwest, and all of his sort of stories were completely sort of the works of the imagination, in which this German immigrant who moves to the American Southwest eventually becomes a cowboy and a sort of unsung hero of Native Americans. In a very classic trope, he has this sort of best friend slash partner who's an Apache chief, and they go on capers together and basically fight off bad guys who are actually mostly white Americans. Um, this is all very relevant to illegal cactus trade today because Fritsch becomes one of the most important cactus collectors in the world during his period of time. And in order to fund his expeditions, he quickly gets to Brazil during this work, and quickly realizes that while the cacti are always going to be there, basically, in his words, he sees a sort of ongoing dispossession and genocide of indigenous cultures and peoples occurring in southern Brazil, and decides to shift his focus to the collection of cultural artifacts in practices and record keeping of these tribes, because he believes that they will surely disappear in a short period of time. And so Fritsch becomes a sort of mercenary acquirer of cultural artifacts amidst this kind of important moment of what we could call salvage anthropology in the early 20th century, in which anxious museums like the Smithsonian and the Ethnology Museum in Berlin are anxious to acquire as many cultural artifacts from indigenous communities that they think are soon going to disappear. And it shouldn't be lost on us that, especially in the context of the German museums that were paying for Fritz's visits or trips by buying up the things he was taking from these tribes and purchasing from them in turn, they were becoming extinct in part because of German colonialism. So there's a relationship here that's really necessary to sort of pay attention to. All to say, though, at the same time that he was acquiring cultural artifacts, he was also always on the lookout for new species of cacti, and he was also selling those cacti back to very hungry private collectors, as well as natural history museums, and also nurseries in Central Europe that would go on to propagate them and then sell them, and still do to this day. A number of the nurseries that he would have sold plants to continue to operate and exist today in Europe. Um, Fritsch stands in as this key iconic figure within the Czech collecting community today of cacti. And so the most significant award that members of the Czechoslovak Cactus and Succulent Society can earn today is called the Golden Alberto, which is a golden plaque of Fritsch's face. He takes on the name Alberto as a sort of Hispanicized version of his own name after spending several decades living in South America. And this is just an image of just one of many, many, many greenhouses that I saw and visited while I was doing research in the Czech Republic, trying to understand these Czech cultural practices and relationships to cacti. And to be clear, these are some of the most extraordinary collections and private collections of cacti in the world. And so one of the things that became really important for me in trying to understand how and why it was that Czechs how were seen as at the epicenter of an illegal cactus and succulent trade was sort of how they marked Fritsch as this character imbued with a sense of sort of heroism and daring do and exploratory prowess that meant part of the sort of value of the practice of caring for cacti in their homes was also to go out into the world, to witness and observe these plants and just, in quote unquote, discover them for themselves. This comes to matter in very important ways because of the latter half of the 20th century, what life is like under Soviet communism in Czechoslovakia at a time in which most Czech people were not able to leave the country. And so it's during this period of time that a lot of the people that I interviewed of an older generation described sort of turning inwards, in their words, to the greenhouse as a space of sort of respite and rescue from the communist regime. And this was sort of mirrored in a few ways. So, one, through sort of multiple layers of signification of these plants as from the West, and sort of what the West kind of came to signify in this period of time as a space of freedom and liberation, but also the landscapes of the West as a site and space of enacting out fantasies of adventure and freedom and the ability to leave the country. This all, and I'm giving this a sort of very short shrift, unfortunately, for our purposes today, but this all comes to matter because by the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Velvet Revolution in '89, once Czechs were able to finally go out and travel and leave Czechoslovakia, they were very, very anxious and excited and anticipating to do so. No less true for cactus people. And what this meant was sort of a group of people who had been patiently waiting for decades to go see a lot of these plants in their native and natural habitats and to sort of visit some of the places that Fritsch himself had been, that he had read about through his biographies and diaries, sort of set loose a group of people on the world that were just really excited to go out and see these plants. Unfortunately, it didn't necessarily align with what had evolved over time as a kind of international conservation ethos in relationship to ethical orientations towards these plants. And so these are just a couple of images as ethnobotanists I wanted to share with you all to sort of suggest ways in which through this work I'm curious how we might kind of approach thinking with this project slightly differently through a more explicit ethnobotanical lens. But for instance, the paying attention to things like individual collectors' personal seed catalogs, and for instance, the sort of note-taking practices and ways of archiving this living material in ways that moves it beyond the realm of objects, but it engages also with these plants as living subjects. And also, again, thinking with sort of psychoanalysis, though, so doing this sort of recursively, because psychoanalysis was sort of the lens that I was using to sort of largely analyze this work, thinking about sort of like what was underpinning these kind of quite colonialist imaginaries within a sort of Central European landlocked country that didn't explicitly engage in colonialism, but perhaps through scientific knowledge practices was still sort of trying to exert a kind of colonialist supremacy in relationship to knowledge and power. And so I want to just show you an image, and I'm not going to say anything about it, but maybe we could just quickly sort of take note of what we observe in this image, what you see and what like sort of where you imagine this to be. Um, Notice the sort of what the ground or substrate looks like and the plants and how they're growing. We all got a chance to take a look at this. Um, this is a sort of zoomed out image of it. And what I want to kind of show is so this is actually a particular style of growing cacti in cultivation. So this is a group of cacti growing inside of a greenhouse in the Czech Republic, in Czechia, but grown in a way that's meant to not only sort of display the plants in a way that they might look in their native habitats in Mexico. But actually is being done so successfully that the plants themselves are actually self-reproducing within this kind of constructed habitat in Central Europe. And what the first thing it should tell us and show us is these are people who really know their stuff. Like this is an extraordinary amount of skill on display in being able to coax these plants out in this way, but also in paying attention to what the plants need, right? Um, so this is a display of about three different kind of genera of cacti: Lophophora or peyote, Eriocarpus, and Strombocactus. Um, and I became really interested in particular. This was a very popular for like really skilled collectors. This was a really popular way of sort of showing off one's skill to other collectors. This is the kind of display of cacti that's only made possible through sort of years of close study and skill, understanding the kind of particularities of substrate and nutrients that these cacti needed. So only some of these cacti would have actually been planted, that they would have actually been reproducing over time in ways that kind of still boggles my mind. But I also wanted to show a couple of other sort of things that we might read in the kind of ethnobotanical framework. So here, for instance, we see in this image, this is the inside of a Czech greenhouse where we have a lot of kind of artifacts that help also tell us a little bit of something about the culture here, right? So we have attached to it notions of nationality and place, the American flag, the Mexican flag. There's also, for instance, like little plaques, like that plaque in the center is this souvenir plaque from Argentina. But then we also have the picture of the bust of the man on the back. That's Alberto Fritsch. That's the sort of like a lot of Czech greenhouses. The men, it's mostly men who do this. It's and we could talk about gender if we want to, which I do in my book. Like he's really held up as this important hero, right? So we have a lot of representations of kind of cultural significance being mapped onto the collections of plants themselves, but also the actual space of the greenhouse and what it indexes um, for these people. Um, where the rubber meets the road and sort of just and I'll wrap up because I've already talked now too long, I've realized. In terms of illegality is so for instance well displayed in this image in that a lot of the plants that you see displayed here are, and we can talk about how I know this, but unambiguously were wild at one point wild harvested plants from places like Brazil and Mexico. Some of them are seed grown, but a lot of them would have originally arrived in the Czech Republic as live plants. And the reason that we're able to talk about an illegal wildlife trade in this context is because these plants are all cacti are registered within what's known as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES for short. I have no idea if that's a totally new acronym for people or one that people are familiar with. But CITES is arguably one of the world's largest and oldest conservation conventions, but it's actually a trade convention rather than a conservation convention. It's a trade convention meant to regulate the trade in wildlife to ensure that wildlife trade does not cause unsustainable damage to wild species populations. And because of the slow-growing nature of many cacti, the way that in which they're desired as ornamental plants around the world, and the fact that actually cacti are one of the most endangered taxa of life on the planet, inclusive of animals, means that the entire cactus family is listed on CITES. Doesn't mean that they can't be traded at all, but it does require export permits, which means it's regulated by the government. And so if you're trading these plants internationally without that kind of paperwork, then you're engaging in a form of illegal wildlife trade. In the crux of what was really fascinating to me in this project and why in the book I theorize this idea of the Robin Hood conservationist in the chapter on the Czechs, which is what I do, is well evidenced in this particular little story that I'll end on, which is a cactus named Mammillaria bertholdii. It was only quote unquote discovered in 2013 by a German self-described cacto explorer named Andreas Berthold. It's a really weird looking cactus. I wouldn't have probably been able to identify it even as being a cactus before this project started. Has this stunning, huge magenta flower, but most of the plant actually lives underground. It has these kind of strange, feathery, pectinate leaves that look like little amoebas. It grows basically in the wild, completely flat against the ground, but it also only grows in a tiny little region of rural Oaxaca outside a set of villages. Um, the same time that it was first described in the literature in 2013, it was already available on the open market in Europe for sale, and originally originating from the Czech Republic. So even just the moment that the plant is formally described in science, it's already for sale abroad. The Mexican government has never issued export permits for this plant. There is no technically legal trade in it, and yet any of you could go onto eBay in whatever country you're probably in and either get seeds or cuttings or cultivated specimens of it, which is to say there's this gray market sort of between the white market and the black market. And that was something I was focused on. But what's interesting about Mammillaria bertholdii and the people who originally first stole it out of Mexico is that on the one hand, collectors themselves saw themselves as no doubt the largest threat that Mammillaria bertholdii faced the minute it was first described. And in the first article published on it by this German Thomas Linsen in 2014, he describes it. He says it's this urge and craving to possess everything that's new and still has the appearance of the unusual that threatens the plant. And then and this is an image of a grafted Mammillaria bertholdii in the hand of a Czech collector. But then At the same time, the one of the people who arguably might have first taken Mammillaria bertholdii out of Mexico or received it argued that if not for him, this plant might already be extinct in the wild, and yet they're made out as the criminals. And so the way we can think about this is that there's no legal trade in the species, but because of collector desires being so intense, the argument of these quote unquote, or what I'm calling Robin Hood conservationists, is that people are going to get this material one way or the other. Isn't it better if we steal a small amount of material out of Mexico and reproduce it in Central Europe and make it available to people in a frame that they call flooding the market, even if it's illegal, rather than allow people to come to rural Oaxaca and just sort of take the species en masse? So the sort of modus operandi of the Robin Hood conservationist is that the law and trade regulations are wrong, and so that answering to a higher moral authority here is justified as an act of species care. And therefore implicitly causing some level of harm to the species is justified to circulate the material. I want to make it really clear that I'm not suggesting that I agree with this perspective, but this was sort of me trying to work to understand their perspective. And that by flooding the market with this propagated plant material, they are crashing the market for more expensive and wild harvested plants. So we can talk about really, I'd like to leave it open-ended at this point to sort of say there's obviously a lot of different threads in pathways I've left open for us to potentially talk about. But so sort of rather than kind of being suggestive of like a very specific conclusion for this part of my work, um, I'm going to skip over my more applied conclusions here and actually suggest instead some open questions that might be engaging for us to think with, which around is for instance includes like how might a more explicit ethnobotanical approach to this work have led it maybe in slightly different directions or revealed alternative kind of insights. And our and this is a question to all of you as well, but our cultural practices with plants in the global north kind of under researched in ethnobotanical literature, and if so, why? And what is that absence kind of index for the field of ethnobotany? And also, I'm curious to hear more about if anyone else is working on sort of practices of collection as a kind of distinctly Western, but not necessarily Western practice in relationship to natural history collecting. And how might a more ethnobotanical approach to the culture of collecting be different than the sort of analysis I provide here? So I'm going to stop there and we can chat.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. Super interesting. I have a question, but I'm gonna wait and see if anybody else has a question first, because I can reach you otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah. So it was a wonderful talk, in fact, very interesting, and all slides were very good. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I just wanted to know, have you worked on some already classified, identified characters, or you classified and identified yourself also by
Oh
collection?
yeah, great question. No, I'm not a botanist.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
that being said, as I want, it was really important for me in this project to learn as much of the botany as I could. And
Mm-hmm.
that's for two reasons. One, I wanted my interlocutors, namely like cactus collectors, to take me seriously. And secondly, it was a way for me to also become more embedded within their cultural practices of and as a result, I became fascinated and quite smitten with these plants as well. And so one of the things that the book does also have is a more autoethnographic component that was quite surprising to me. Because I mean, their obsessions rubbed off on me, and it didn't take long for me to become a cactus collector of a kind as well, without obviously not like of the kind of like going out and taking plants from the wild. But you can't go visit cactus men in their greenhouses and not leave with some plants because they always have too many and they never have enough space. And so it's a way of sort of engaging in a reciprocal form of gift giving that is quite lovely. And by the time I finished my postdoc, I probably had 50 cacti. Which ironically then I had to give away because I was living in the UK and had to go back to the US and it would have been quite difficult to get permits. So
Yes. So, my second question
yeah.
is, are these cacti traffickers using it for selling it, or do they use it for other purposes? What for they do the trafficking?
Yeah, so there's obviously well, not obviously, there's a number of different kind of categories of people who engage in this practice. There are certainly some people who do it explicitly for commercialization purposes, but a lot of the people that I was engaged with who were taking plants, a lot of them, for instance, were only doing it for their own personal collections. So this is just ornamental
Okay.
trade, of and but then others would also, for instance, like it would be for their personal collections, but then they might also sell plants um, to fund their next expedition. And then there were others who were doing it for profit, and so it kind of ran the spectrum.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Great questions. Kate, do you want me to field questions?
I can do it.
Up to you.
Savannah, how about you go ahead and then we'll get to the question in the chat.
Thank you for sharing your talk, Jared. This is really interesting. I have a kind of brief connection to this topic because when I was an undergrad, I was studying abroad in Italy, and I had this internship at their botanic garden there.
Hmm.
And the project I was brought onto was an ex vivo conservation study for the cacti that they had in their collections, and because almost all of the cacti they had been confiscated by CITES.
Yeah.
So they had this like whole collection. I think if I like turn off my video, I think my picture is me standing behind
Oh yeah.
their their greenhouse with like all the cacti actually. And so we were looking at barrel cacti and collecting seeds, and it was more for like um understanding how to raise these plants outside of their native habitat.
Mhm.
And so like yeah, like germinability, viability, and this was in 2020, so this was kind of before that, like I think it was a 2021 article you shared of like bringing it more to like popular attention. But I don't know, it was just interesting to see this topic come back. Um, one of my question is like kind of totally unrelated, but do you know if there is an equal amount of interest or desire for plants in the euphorbia family,
Mhm.
like the Euphorbiaceae, because those
Yeah.
oftentimes they can look a lot like
Yeah.
cacti and they get really wiggy and
Mhm.
cool looking, So I don't know um if there is a distinction there among the collectors that you talked about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting history in Italy as well. One of the most significant recent in recent memory cactus kind of poaching busts occurred in Italy actually. Um, of Copiapoa cacti from Chile. And but the to your question, so the best way of thinking about kind of like what a collection is, and this is getting at your question, is like a collection is just anything sort of taken out of its ordinary use function and put into some kind of order that makes sense to the collector. Which is to say that if you have a bunch of spoons, but then you decide that there's a rhyme or reason to putting certain kinds of spoons inside of a shadow box and putting them on your wall, you've developed a collection of spoons because they're no longer being used to eat soup. So that's all to say that all collections are entirely arbitrary. And so one, for instance, way that some collectors collect is related to like taxonomic collecting. It's a quite common one, especially among European and North American collectors. In which case there are a lot of euphorbia that there are people who collect cacti and euphorbia. I've met collectors of succulents who only collect euphorbia, for instance. And it's just because that's what they decide is important to them. I've also met cactus collectors who hate euphorbia. So like so it's sort of a yes, but I just sort of wanted to give a sense that like there are also collectors I've spent time with who like are purely aesthetic in their orientations, and they just like plants that put out pink flowers. And they're going to collect along those lines. And so it's arbitrary, but it does matter obviously in terms of the sort of future of different kinds of plant life. But yeah, euphorbias are in there. I think in part because they're more toxic, they pose additional risks for certain kinds of collectors in terms of like if they have animals and stuff like that. But yeah, there and also a lot. They're not exclusively, but there are also a lot of euphorbias that get a lot bigger than a lot of other cacti, and so space can be an issue with some of the euphorbias as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think let's go to the question in the chat, asking about how you did your interviews and you used questionnaires.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I never, well, I'll answer it in two parts. In the work that I was just sharing now, it was based on a mix of participatory and non-participatory observation, semi-structured and unstructured interviews, and essentially what I think of as ethnographic work, and just a lot of note taking and also photography. And one of the reasons that I used a lot of photography was because it's a really important part of the collecting hobby as well. So taking photographs of cacti is a really big part of the hobby for a lot of collectors. And so I didn't share that chat like section of the talk, but I talk a lot about sort of the role of the camera and the lens. And especially macro photography is really popular with a lot of cacti collectors and cacti enthusiasts. And so I kind of became interested in sort of what the role of looking up close was for a lot of collectors and enthusiasts. I did eventually do some social survey research though, and I have a published paper in conservation biology that is based on a survey of about 500 cactus and succulent collectors in North America and in Europe about illegal wildlife trade practices as well as motivations for collecting. So I only did that after I did all of my qualitative work, and it's like a approach that I think works really well because they're the way I approached the questions I had and how I phrased the questions was informed by several years of qualitative work that preceded it. I actually am just wrapping up another qualitative survey or a survey with Korean succulent consumers right now on a transnational project with a South African collaborator, and we're actually headed to South Korea this week to meet with Korean government officials about that work. So yeah, I'm methodologically agnostic, and so I'm not a big survey person. But I didn't do field questionnaires. So I've only ever done with this work online surveys, and then I've done kind of your more traditional and typical kind of ethnographic and qualitative work. It says BB has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. I wonder if you can talk about your experience working with ethnobotanists, not being an ethnobotanist, at least initially yourself. How did they respond, and how did you overcome any differences, etc.?
Sorry if I misspoke. I've still never, as far as I know, I've still never worked with an ethnobotanist. I've been reading more and more ethnobotany since then. But I was doing a visit at Kew Botanical Gardens, and I was in their economic botany collection, and I was talking about my project, and I'd given a talk, like a lunchtime seminar talk, and they sort of made an offhanded comment that there was a need for a lot more kind of ethnobotanical study of collecting practices. And I said something like, is that even a thing? Like, can we even talk about an ethnobotanical approach to collecting? And they were like, yeah, of course. Like, you're talking about human cultural relationships with plants. That sounds an awful lot like ethnobotany. And I think, and I'm curious to hear from all of you about this, but I think it's in part because of the bias in the literature, but so much of that the ethnobotany that I'm familiar with and have read in the past, and continue to read, is really focused on, for instance, especially in the realm of plants, like medicinal plant uses, but also the sort of cultural values of plants in sort of non-Western contexts. And so I'm very curious to hear more about what the sort of ethnobotanical field looks like in kind of places like collector practices in a place like Europe. Um, but because I didn't frame my project in that way, it's genuinely, it's an open question. It's something I'd like to actually think with and potentially do some more collaborative writing on.
It's interesting because I'm not an ethnobotanist, but I'm working with some Maasai who are not trained ethnobotanists, but of course, in the Western way, they're, very much undisciplined ethnobotanists, but they're experts. And I think their reaction to the idea of collections would be to laugh and to be astonished because the place for the plants is in the wild
Yeah.
where they live, where the Maasai live. You don't have collections in your house or anywhere. And part of that is because their whole culture is not based on possessing anything but cattle. They have nowhere to put all of the things that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of genre of ethnobotany I'm more familiar with. And so I guess it would be interesting to sort of think about what maybe I missed by not thinking more closely with the ethnobotanical scholarship in my project. Any other questions or thoughts, comments?
I do have one other one. Were any of the collectors interested in the psychedelic properties of some cactus?
That's a really good question. I early on was trying to decide whether or not to, obviously you tell people you're interested in illegal cactus trade, and a lot of people automatically assume you're talking about peyote, or some
San
other.
Pedro?
Yeah, I mean, there's San Pedro. There's a couple of cacti that have psychoactive properties. I made an intentional decision in my project that I was going to kind of steer clear of that work, and for a couple of reasons. One, it felt like biting off more than I could chew in one project. Two, it's a radically different form of consumption in drivers. And three, it does entangle with, like, there are people who've spent years obviously doing meaningful ethnobotanical research on indigenous uses and practices of those particular kinds of medicine. But there's also more recent research on the sort of commodification of those practices by, like, psychedelic tourism industries and stuff like that. So it just felt like opening too big of a can of worms that was it really it needed to be its own thing. The problem of illegal trade in peyote in San Pedro is real, is like a real problem. The world's largest producer of peyote today is Thailand. Um, so it is a transnational question and it's global. But yeah, I ended up deciding that it was a kind of different project.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Great question. Important question. There's a question. Kate, I don't mind just jumping in,
Yeah,
if you
go
want.
ahead.
Yeah, so Jose Luis has this question. I would like to know how the community's behavior has changed around this plant now that they know it's being investigated. Thank you. Um, so, it's interesting. I think if, I tried really, really hard in my book to treat all of my interlocutors with the kind of, I think, sensitivity and respect that anyone doing ethnography deserves to give their subjects, whether they're engaged in illegal or illicit practices or whether I agreed with those practices or not. Um, and so I think that the treatment I give a lot of the Czech collectors in the book is quite sympathetic. And actually, I've had a lot of conservationists get mad at me because they think that I've, like, sort of painted them as not as, like, the black and white villains that they sort of see them as, or that they want them to be. Or alternatively, like Mexican law enforcement, who are people I spent a lot of time interviewing and spending time with as well. Um, I got a lot of flack from the Czech community about this chapter in my book, and they felt like I had sort of, made them sound really bad and like these villains. I still stand by the work, and I don't think I did. Um, but they sort of refuted the idea that the problem was as big as the media makes it sound, or that I made it sound in my book. I actually think I downplayed it a lot. But then, like, I just shared what happened a few days ago, which is to say that the problem continues. I would say overall, across most of the hobby in my survey work, evidences this as well. There is the mainstream community of people who collect and care about cactus and succulent plants and keep ornamental collections want the plants to be conserved and to do well in the world. And they don't break the law and they don't trade and go out in the world and steal plants. And they understand why that's not, in general, a good thing to do. There are still a small number of there's definitely still a group of actors who don't see things that way. Um, there was a narrative within the community that it was sort of only old guard collectors who still were breaking the law and doing this because they were collecting before CITES came into existence in 1975. Our evidence suggests that actually the internet, our evidence kind of refutes that and argues that actually a lot of the people who are engaging in illegal wildlife trade over the internet through, for instance, buying plants on eBay and stuff like that, are actually younger. And so even if they're not going out in the world and directly taking the plants themselves, which is what a lot of these older folks, collectors do, which in part is because of the joy and like the excitement and thrills of like going out and breaking the law in person. The people buying from behind the screen are probably a bigger part of the problem now. And it's just really easy. It's out in the open, even though it's illegal. Like you can go on eBay and buy illegal cacti quite easily. And eBay's aware of it, and they are actually trying to actively work on it with researchers to try to stop it. But it's quite can be quite challenging to get around. And obviously, it's a lower priority issue than like, making sure that illegal gun trade and drug trade isn't happening over the internet. And in this way, plants have a long history of being deprioritized as, important in relationship to both animal and human life, but other issues as well. I guess that's all to say. I'm generally optimistic about the overarching arc and direction of the sort of culture. And, most of these societies have conservation missions. That being said, in our survey, we found that people who best understood CITES laws and regulations were also the most likely to be the people breaking them.
Okay, maybe I'll ask my question now,
Yeah,
if I'm allowed.
go for it.
So this is going back more to like the psychoanalysis
Yeah.
part. And I don't really have like a formulated question, but as you were talking, I kind of jotted down you said something about like what is going on in these people's imaginations where like a plant in the wild feels like more real
Yeah,
or
yeah.
more like deserving of a place in their collection. So could you just like say more about that maybe?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sorry for it's really hard to like talk lightly about psychoanalytic theory, which is just a way of saying it took me a long time to find my way through it, and I'm happy to like be in conversation with people about what that process was like because I didn't come to this project as Kate knows, I didn't come to this project with a sort of deep knowledge of psychoanalysis. It was a real process of learning and unlearning, I would say. So yeah, there seems to still be within the context of a lot of the collector community, even if people sort of don't engage in wild harvesting of plants, this idea of sort of the plant in the wild as representing something somehow more authentic than like say the cultivated plant in the greenhouse. And I think a lot of us might share that in certain ways, right? Whether it's like, you could think about the sort of way people think about animals in captivity versus sort of like in the wild, right? And part of that, I think, is probably about relationships under capitalism and commodification practices. And so, like, what happens to the lively thing? So I'm thinking with like Rosemary Collard's work around lively capital or lively commodities. Like, what happens in the process of rendering living organisms as commodities with exchange value, whether that's a cactus or a pet parrot, um, in which its value under capitalism is attached to its living status. Like a dead cactus is not worth the same thing as a living cactus, but nevertheless, it's been rendered otherwise in the commodity, the shape of the commodity form. And so there's a way of sort of imagining the wild as beyond that capitalist commodification form that I think entices the imagination as having this trace of the quote unquote real behind it, which is that like that of the unmediated world beyond sort of without sort of human signification, as something that holds more of an aura. Like, so this is like the idea of the aura coming from Walter Benjamin, but like the idea that possesses something of a kind of affect that has power over us. And there's something very compelling in that. And there's a chapter of my book in which I try to contend with that a little bit more in this own moment in the book where I kind of like sort of encounter this like cactus that sort of emerges as this like sublime object. And like how and why that happens when like it's just a cactus, but then like what happens when it becomes re-signified through cultural practices. Yeah, it's probably not like I'm not sure that really helps or not, but
No,
yeah.
thank you. Savannah, did you want to ask your second question and then we could get to Austin's collection question in the chat?
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't know, from like the different angles like an ethnobotanist might come at this.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you interviewed like Mexican law enforcement agents and stuff. And bringing up, that one new cactus from like southern Oaxaca, I wonder, did you at all um interview or talk with like local people who live, in these plants' natural habitat,
Yeah.
ask them, their thoughts about the illegal trade and their own relationship to these plants? And
Yeah.
I wonder if, you know, somehow like because I'm thinking of like a collector far removed from this native habitat, especially a collector with um, you know, maybe less scruples about how they get their cacti or who see themselves as more of this like Robin Hood type character. I think it's easier to dismiss the concerns of a plant, like the concerns about the well-being of a plant. But if, the I don't know, the feelings or the significance of like the people
Yeah.
from these areas was somehow like brought over as well. Like if there was some sort of connection or bridge made between like the collectors and, you know, people living in that habitat in a constructive way, if that might
Yeah.
help to kind of get the message across better than um just thinking about like the plant's well-being. That might be more convincing.
Yeah. So I said that there was a big advantage to my project from COVID, which was that I had a lot of time to like work my way slowly through the extremely challenging writing of Jacques Lacan. What got cut from the project because of COVID was a lot of planned field work in rural Oaxaca. And so to answer your question, the book explicitly, and I say this out at the beginning, like doesn't offer the kinds of perspectives that you're describing.
Mm,
And part of that came out of the limitations of not being able to finish the field work in the way that I had initially planned on and hoped to. Looking back, I kind of am almost glad in the sense that I think there's something really valuable in sticking with the kind of cultures of collecting in the kinds of research subjects I had. In many ways, what you're describing is what I would love like to be book two, which is like rather than the cactus hunters, be like the cactus keepers. Because the important thing, and this is like where my current work in South Africa comes into play as well, you know these one of the real challenges with illegal trading cacti, right, is like it's the plant's temporality that's a big part of the problem, that cacti grow really slowly for the most part. And the slowest growing cacti are often most valued because of how slow growing they are, which means that when they're poached or taken from the wild, like the effects of it are compounding, right? They're slower to reproduce. They often have lower recruitment rates from the seed bank. Like there are all these ways that like the cards are kind of stacked against them when you bring in kind of human intervention, which also tells us though in these places in which people have also always lived that the reason that these plants are still there is because people allowed that to be the case, right? And so what you're describing matters hugely then in these stories of human plant relationships. It's just not the story in this particular book, but it's a really important one. Um, and if I don't get to do that work, I hope someone, does. And there are, obviously that's not to say there's not any ethnobotanical research on cacti. There is, just not in the particular context of some of the specific species that I was looking at, like Mammillaria bertholdii. So it remains a void in the project, but a really important one.
Mhm.
Thank you. It's a good, really
Yeah.
important point. Austin had this question. I mentioned having around 50 cacti. Which ones? Were they wild harvested? No. Um, I did not participate in any illegal trafficking of plants. They were all very run-of-the-mill cultivated plants that were grown from seeds by collectors, mostly in Sheffield, England, where my postdoc was based. So a lot of, I mean, that which isn't just, it was a lot of Mexican cacti, a lot of mammillaria, but nothing too crazy. I'm trying to think. So the interesting side note to that is that I ended up having to give them all away because it would have been too expensive to try to transport them back to the US, but now I'm back in the UK and I have three cacti though back in the US that I've now had for coming on close to 10 years that have come to mean a lot to me. And that's actually the first chapter of my book focuses on that sort of individual human plant relationships with cacti. And so I'm currently in the process as a kind of autoethnographic experience again of trying to successfully get CITES export permits so that I can import my plants. And it is a lot of work so far and expensive. So I also think there are some practical reasons why people sometimes break the law.
Well, if there are no more questions, I guess last call for questions. Savannah.
I'm sorry. You mentioned the influence of the internet
Yeah.
on the landscape of cactus hunters, like the demographics and everything. Um, the influence of the internet on plant usage is something that has has been published on
Mm.
relatively recently in like the ethnobotany world. So I put out a paper last year about the influence of the internet on harvesting and collecting medicinal plants in a
Mm.
medicinal plant in North America. And I
Mm.
know Emile de Meyer um, published a paper on the influence of the internet and WhatsApp on um, the use of I can't remember I can't remember if they were Congolese or like African immigrant populations in Europe
Mm.
talking with their families and like um using their traditional plants for like COVID related
Mm.
properties. So that is like this idea of like kind of digital ethnobotany
Yeah.
and how human plant uses change or morph because of the internet has is something that has been published. And I don't know if if that's an area that you're interested in. But I know that is something other people are thinking about.
That's
Um,
fantastic to hear. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work is
yeah.
on internet stuff these days. So I'm going to do some Googling around, but if you have anything that you want to send me, I'm going to in case it's helpful, I'm going to put my email in the chat for anyone if anyone wants to be in touch. I'm happy to be in contact with folks. But yeah, thank you. That's a helpful thing to know about. I don't know if you want me to take this one or not, Kate. There's a last question from Austin about the impact of AI on cacti.
Yeah, if you want to, you can, but if you
Just
have
really
some.
briefly, I'll just say there's a research project that's trying to use computer machine learning, which I don't really think that counts as AI, but I mean it's machine learning, so maybe to try to better understand trade networks through online plant trafficking. It's called FloraGuard. I don't know how active the project is right now. I think their funding may have ended. It was a research project, but they were working with Traffic, which is the big wildlife trafficking, anti-trafficking agency. In terms of how it might affect cactus conservation, like leaving research questions aside, I don't know. That's an interesting question. It's one I'd have to think about. My work did not engage in anything related to it. The one thing might be potentially how people respond to and thwart trade filters on eBay. So like I didn't show a slide of like some of the ways and practices that people use to sort of get around trade like filters on Instagram and eBay these days. They're not complicated though, and they don't require the use of AI or anything like that. It's just like spelling species names wrong intentionally, stuff like that, and making up species names that other collectors are aware of. But yeah. It's very easy to get involved in the illegal trade of cactus plants if you want to. I just don't recommend it. This is what my book looks like, by the way, in case anyone needs it's got a nice cover. It's got a pretty plant
It's
on
a great book. Everybody should read it.
it. But yeah, genuinely happy to be in touch with anyone if it helps.
All right, well, I'm going to do my little closing
Yeah.
spiel and then stop the recording. But thank you, Jared. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for everybody who joined us today at the SEB Student Cafe. And on a final note, I do want to remind everybody that if you are not a member of SEB, but you would like to become one, we do have financial aid opportunities available, which you can apply for by emailing Amelia at her email that I will drop into the chat. All right. And yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm going to end this recording now, and we hope to see you at the next Student Cafe.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Yeah.